I wasn't planning on going for a walk that night. It was one of those days where everything felt off. Work had been a disaster, my phone was blowing up with messages I didn't want to answer, and I was generally just stuck in my own head. But around 11 p.m., I found myself restless, unable to just sit there and scroll through the same old feeds. So I slipped on my sneakers and stepped outside, deciding to take a walk through the neighborhood to clear my head. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, making every little sound feel amplified. There was this icy, late February chill in the air, sharp enough to sting your face if you weren't careful. I figured the cold would snap me out of my funk, or at least distract me for a while. I didn't have any destination in mind, just keep moving until my brain stopped spinning. About 15 minutes in, I cut through the small park that sits between the rows of apartment buildings. I usually avoid it at night since it's mostly deserted and dimly lit, but that night it felt like the perfect place to let my thoughts roam without distractions. I wasn't expecting to find anyone else there, especially not someone sitting on the bench under the flickering street lamp, looking like they'd been crying. He was hunched over, shoulders shaking slightly, a jacket pulled tight around him, but there was no doubt the glow of his red, puffy eyes caught my attention almost immediately. It's strange how you notice things like that, even when your own head is full of noise. I slowed down, debating whether I should just keep walking or if I should check in. Something about the way he was sitting there, so alone and raw, pulled at something in me. "Hey," I said, my voice quieter than I expected. He startled, looked up, and for a second, I saw this flicker of embarrassment and surprise in his eyes. Then he gave a small, almost sad smile, and that's when I realized I didn't want to just walk away. "Rough night?" I asked, sitting down at the other end of the bench. Not too close, but close enough to be there. He nodded, wiped at his face with the sleeve of his jacket. "Yeah, you could say that." We ended up talking for the next hour, the kind of conversation that starts out awkward, but slowly finds its rhythm. I learned his name was Jamie. He was new to the city, fresh out of a relationship that had left him more shaken than he wanted to admit. There was no dramatic story, no big event that tore him apart, just the quiet kind of heartbreak that sneaks up on you in the dark, the kind that makes you want to disappear. I told him a bit about myself, about feeling stuck in the same rut I'd been in for what felt like forever. We traded stories like two people trying to remind each other that they weren't alone in this messy, confusing world. By the time we finally parted ways, the first hints of dawn were starting to break. I didn't expect to feel hopeful walking home, but somehow, I did. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this random, cold night walk had turned into something I wasn't ready to let go of. It's funny how sometimes the smallest moments stick with you. Like, I never thought I'd remember the way Jamie's breath came out in little clouds in the cold morning air, or how the street lamp above the bench buzzed softly as if trying to keep us company. But that night, everything felt sharp and real, in a way that usually takes weeks or months to sink in. We exchanged numbers before I left, mostly because it felt right, I guess. Like maybe neither of us wanted to go back to being strangers again. I didn't expect him to text me the next day, but when his message popped up on my phone early in the afternoon, just a simple, "Hey, it's me," it caught me off guard in the best way. We started texting more after that. Nothing heavy at first, just the usual small talk about weather, favorite coffee spots, the usual city survival stuff. But that casual back and forth somehow felt different with Jamie. There was an ease in his words, like talking to someone who didn't have any filters or pretenses. It was refreshing, and as much as I tried not to overthink it, I found myself looking forward to those messages, refreshing my phone every few minutes. A few days later, he suggested grabbing coffee. I said yes before I even had time to hesitate. We met at this little hole-in-the-wall cafe that smelled like fresh bread and strong espresso, tucked away on a side street not far from his apartment. I remember the way he smiled when he saw me, this genuine, shy smile that made my chest tighten for reasons I couldn't explain. We ended up sitting in a corner, away from the buzz of other customers, and just talked. Not just surface stuff, but things you usually keep hidden. Hopes, fears, what made us laugh until we cried. I found out he was an artist, which made sense because there was something quietly creative about how he looked at the world. And in turn, I shared parts of myself I rarely let out in public. Somewhere between the second cup of coffee and the third awkward pause, I realized I hadn't been this comfortable around anyone in a long time. And maybe that was what scared me the most, how easy it was to like him. The weeks that followed were this strange, beautiful blur. We found ourselves meeting up more, sometimes just to walk around the city or share a late-night slice of pizza. Jamie had this habit of tucking his hands into his pockets and looking down when he was nervous, which was all the time, honestly, but it made him even more endearing. One evening, we found ourselves back in that same park where I'd first seen him. The bench was empty, the street lamp flickering lazily overhead. We sat side by side, not saying much, just soaking in the quiet. Then, out of nowhere, Jamie reached over and took my hand. I didn't pull away. Instead, I squeezed his fingers gently, and in that simple touch, everything seemed to shift. It wasn't about grand declarations or dramatic gestures. It was just two people who had found each other when they needed it most, holding on like it was the only thing that made sense. But here's the thing about beginnings. They're never as neat as you want them to be. Just when I thought things might be heading somewhere real, life decided to throw a curveball. Jamie got a call about a potential job opportunity in another city. Something big, something he'd been chasing for years but hadn't told me about. It was a chance to finally make a name for himself, to step out of the shadows he'd been living in. I was happy for him, truly. But the idea of him leaving felt like this punch in the gut I didn't see coming. We talked long into the night about what it meant for us, for the fragile connection we'd built. Neither of us wanted to let go, but the reality was messy and complicated. He didn't want to hold me back, and I didn't want to be the reason he missed out on his dream. So we found ourselves at a crossroads, caught between hope and uncertainty. I still remember the night before he left, the way the city looked different, almost like it was holding its breath. We met at the park again, the place that had somehow become our little world. We sat on that bench, hands intertwined, and for the first time, I let myself admit what I'd been feeling all along. "I don't want this to end," I said, voice barely above a whisper. Jamie looked at me, really looked at me, and his eyes were full of something I couldn't name. "Me neither," he said, and just like that, we made a promise. Not some fairy tale vow, but a real one, forged in the quiet moments between us. That no matter where life took us, we'd try. We'd fight for this, whatever it was, because sometimes the best stories start on a cold night when you find a stranger crying on a bench. And maybe, just maybe, they lead you to something worth holding on to. The morning Jamie left is still stuck in my head. The way his eyes looked brighter than the sunrise, even though there was that heaviness between us. The unspoken question of how this was supposed to work. We hugged tight at the train station, neither of us really wanting to let go, but eventually, the whistle blew, and he was gone. Those first few days without him were brutal. I found myself checking my phone obsessively, hoping for a text or a call. Even a late-night message that just said, "Hey," or "Miss you," would have been enough. But life kept moving like it always does, and I had to figure out how to exist in this new normal without him physically there. I won't lie, parts of me felt like a mess. The kind you try to hide, but that makes your stomach twist every time you remember the empty space where he used to be. Jamie, though, he was good about keeping in touch. Video calls, texts, dumb memes sent at random hours. We shared little slices of our days, trying to stay connected across miles and time zones. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. One Friday evening, about 2 weeks after he left, I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone and trying not to let the silence get too loud when Jamie called. I answered, and right away, I could tell something was off. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "Hey." His voice was quieter than usual. "Can we talk?" Like, really talk? I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Of course. What's up?" He took a breath, and I could practically hear him pacing on the other end. "This job, it's amazing, and I'm so grateful for the chance, but it's also way harder than I expected. I'm working crazy hours, and I don't really know anyone here. I feel lost." My chest tightened. I wanted to reach through the phone and pull him close, tell him it was okay to feel like that. Instead, I said, "I'm sorry, man. That sounds rough. Want to tell me more? He did, opening up about the loneliness, the pressure, the nights he thought about just quitting and coming back. I listened, telling him he wasn't alone, reminding him of how strong he was, even when he didn't feel it. That conversation lasted for hours. And when we finally hung up, I felt this strange mix of sadness and hope. Sad because he was hurting, but hopeful because he was still letting me in. Over the next month, our conversations became more frequent and intense. I found myself craving the sound of his voice, the way he laughed when I told a dumb joke, or the way he'd sigh when he was tired. We started sharing parts of ourselves we hadn't before, things we'd kept hidden, fears about the future, memories of past heartbreaks. It was like we were building something real, even though we were miles apart. One weekend, I flew out to see him. The airport was a mess, but as soon as I saw him waiting there, looking a little taller and a lot more tired than the last time, everything else faded away. We hugged so tightly, I thought we'd both disappear into that moment. His apartment was small and cluttered with canvases, paint tubes, and half-finished sketches, a chaotic reflection of who he was. We spent hours wandering the city, just talking and trying to catch up on the time we'd lost. At night, we curled up on the couch, sharing stories and dreams, the kind of nights that make you forget about everything else. But the distance was still there, lurking beneath the surface, reminding us this wasn't a simple story. Jamie's job was demanding, and my life back home was no less complicated. We both had commitments, responsibilities, and a million reasons why being together full-time wasn't easy. One particularly rough evening, right after a long day for both of us, we got into an argument over something stupid, like where to order dinner from. It spiraled, fueled by exhaustion and frustration, and suddenly it felt like we were worlds apart even though we were in the same room. "I just don't know if this is working anymore," Jamie said, voice shaking, and for a moment I was terrified that those words would tear everything apart. But then I caught his eye, and there was this raw honesty there that stopped me. "I don't want to give up," I told him. "Not on us." He nodded slowly, and we sat in silence for a while, just holding on to each other. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it was real. That night taught me something important, that love isn't just about the good times or the easy moments. It's about fighting for each other when things get messy and uncomfortable. It's about showing up even when you're scared or tired. We're still figuring it out, still navigating the ups and downs of a long-distance relationship that sometimes feels like it's pulling us apart instead of bringing us closer. But I'm grateful for every step, every late-night call, every awkward hug, because all of it led me to Jamie. And honestly, if that night walk hadn't pushed me out the door, I might never have found him sitting on that bench, crying and waiting for someone to notice. Life is messy and unpredictable, but sometimes it's those unexpected moments that change everything. The months after that visit were a kind of roller coaster, the kind where you buckle up hoping it's worth the ups and downs. Jamie and I kept at it, balancing the long-distance thing the best we could. We had our routines, morning texts, late-night calls, surprise visits when either of us could swing it. But the real magic happened when we got to be together in person. Those moments made the distance manageable, even if just barely. One chilly Saturday evening, about 4 months into all this, I flew out to see him again. The city he lived in was different from mine. Grayer skies, a slower pace, but it had this quiet charm I didn't expect to like. Jamie picked me up from the airport, wearing that same nervous smile he had when we first met, like he wasn't sure if this was real either. We drove back to his apartment, windows fogged up as we laughed about dumb stuff, trying not to think about the fact that in a few days, I'd be gone again. That night, we cooked dinner together. Well, Jamie mostly did, and I tried to keep out of his way without being useless. After eating, we sat on the floor by the window, wrapped in a shared blanket, watching the city lights blink on. There was a pause, one of those comfortable silences where you don't feel the need to fill every second. "Do you ever think about what it'd be like if we lived in the same city?" Jamie asked, voice low. I nodded, tracing the rim of my mug. "All the time. But it's scary too. Like, how do you just change everything when you're so used to the way things are?" He laughed softly. "I guess we're both scared of messing this up." I looked up, locking eyes with him. "Maybe that's a good thing. Means we care." Jamie smiled, this time a little less nervous and a little more certain. Yeah, I want to see where this goes. Not just the easy parts, but the hard ones too. It was one of those moments where everything clicks into place. I realized right then that I wasn't just holding on to Jamie because he was a comfort or distraction. I wanted him, for all of it, but reality has this funny way of reminding you that love stories don't come with guarantees. A few weeks later, I got a call from one of my closest friends back home. They'd been diagnosed with something serious, and I was needed. Suddenly, my own life felt like it was tipping off balance in ways I hadn't anticipated. Work piled up, and I found myself torn between being there for Jamie and handling things on my end. I started missing calls, sometimes going days without replying. Every time my phone buzzed with his name, I felt guilty, like I was letting him down even though I was drowning. Jamie, being the person he is, didn't complain, not out loud, but the distance grew heavier between us, like this unspoken weight pressing in from both sides. One night, after a particularly long silence, he sent me a message that stopped me cold. I miss you, but I don't know if this is enough anymore. It hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to respond with all the things, how much I missed him, how I was trying, but the words tangled up inside me. I called him instead. Jamie? I started, voice shaky. I'm sorry. I know I haven't been great lately. I'm just overwhelmed. He didn't say anything at first. Then, quietly, I get that. I just don't want us to become strangers. Neither did I. We talked that night for hours, trying to bridge the silence that had grown between us. I shared what was going on with my friend and work, and Jamie opened up about feeling isolated in his new city. We promised to do better, to be honest, even when it's hard. It wasn't a magic fix, but it was a start. And sometimes, that's enough. A few months after that, Jamie surprised me by showing up at my apartment unannounced. I was cooking dinner when I heard a knock, and there he was, standing in the doorway, a little out of breath, holding a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked himself. I couldn't wait any longer, he admitted with a grin. That night, we stayed up talking about everything, the past struggles, the future fears, the hope that still flickered between us. We made plans, tentative but real, about how we might close the distance for good. It's not an easy path, and I won't pretend it is. But with Jamie, for the first time in a long time, I feel like maybe the messiness is part of the beauty. Like love isn't about perfection, but about showing up, even when no one's watching. And sometimes it's about a chance encounter on a cold night that leads you to someone who makes the world feel a little less lonely. After that night, when Jamie showed up at my door with those wildflowers, things started to feel a little different between us. Like all the distance, the missed calls, and the silence had been this storm we weathered together, and now we were standing in the calm afterward. It didn't mean everything was fixed, far from it, but there was this renewed sense that we were on the same team, trying to figure out how to make us a real thing. We spent that weekend mostly holed up in my apartment, cooking, binge-watching terrible reality shows, and just talking about what came next. Jamie had been thinking about moving, and honestly, I had been too. We started brainstorming cities where we could both find work, where the rent wouldn't kill us, and where maybe, finally, we wouldn't have to be long distance anymore. But here's the thing about big decisions. They're scary, and messy, and full of what-ifs. One afternoon, a few days after Jamie's visit, we sat on the couch surrounded by open laptops and half-empty takeout boxes. I was scrolling through job listings when Jamie suddenly closed his computer and looked at me. You know, I'm scared, he said, voice softer than usual. What if moving here doesn't work out? What if I mess everything up again? I reached out and took his hand. Hey, no one's expecting perfection. We're just figuring it out, one step at a time. And whatever happens, we do it together. He smiled, but the worry didn't completely leave his eyes. A week later, Jamie officially gave notice at his job. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I watched as he packed up his apartment remotely while I juggled my own schedule back home, feeling the distance between us shrink, but also the pressure grow. When Jamie finally arrived, dragging 2 heavy suitcases through my front door. It felt surreal. We collapsed on the couch, exhausted but grinning like idiots. "I'm really here," he whispered, like saying it out loud made it more real. "You're here," I replied, feeling a weight lift off my chest. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of adjustment, sharing a space after all those months apart, learning each other's habits, figuring out how to live side by side. It wasn't always easy. There were times when we clashed over little things: what to watch on TV, how to split chores, how much space each of us needed. But those moments were balanced by the quiet mornings, when we made coffee together, the late-night talks about everything and nothing, and the way his hand found mine without thinking. One night, about a month after he moved in, we were lying in bed when Jamie turned to me, eyes shining in the dim light. "I'm so glad I didn't give up on this," he said. "Neither am I," said, pulling him close. We talked for hours about our past heartbreaks and hopes for the future, about the fear that sometimes still lurked but didn't feel so big anymore. That night, I realized how much I'd grown to rely on him, not just as a boyfriend but as a true partner. Of course, life kept throwing curveballs. My friend's health took a turn for the worse, and I found myself juggling hospital visits and work, sometimes feeling stretched too thin. Jamie was there through it all, offering support in his quiet, steady way. It wasn't just the romantic stuff. It was the everyday kindness that made me feel like I wasn't alone. One afternoon, after a long day at the hospital, I came home drained and defeated. Jamie met me at the door with a tired but genuine smile. "You okay?" he asked. I shook my head and let the tears come. Without a word, he pulled me into a hug, held me like I was his whole world. "I'm here," he whispered. And in that moment, it was enough. The hardest part of our journey has been learning to lean on each other when life gets messy. The sickness, the stress, the uncertainty. But it's also been the most beautiful part. Last weekend, we went back to that park where it all started. The same bench, the same flickering street lamp. We sat there, hands entwined, watching the city hum around us. Jamie smiled and squeezed my hand. "Remember that night?" he said. "When I was crying and you just sat down next to me?" I nodded. "Yeah, I never thought that would change my life." "Me neither," he said softly. "But I'm glad it did." We stayed there a while longer, wrapped up in each other and the quiet glow of the city at night. And as we sat on that old bench, I realized that sometimes the most unexpected moments lead you to exactly where you're supposed to be. Still messy, still uncertain, but tightly together. That night on the bench, under the flickering street lamp, felt like some kind of full circle moment. We were quiet for a while, just soaking in the feeling of being together in the place where it all started. But then Jamie looked over at me and said something that caught me off guard. "You ever think about how different things could have been? Like, what if I hadn't been crying that night? What if you just walked on by?" I squeezed his hand, thinking about it. Honestly, I probably wouldn't have stopped, but I'm really glad I did. He smiled, this genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and I felt this rush, like I was right where I was supposed to be. It hit me then, how sometimes life throws these little moments your way, and they change everything without any warning. After a while, we got up and started walking through the park. The night air was crisp, and the city seemed quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that makes you notice the small stuff, the rustling leaves, the distant hum of traffic, the way Jamie's hand found mine again without me even asking. We ended up at this tiny diner that was still open, the kind with neon signs buzzing overhead, and the smell of coffee that never left. We sat in a booth near the window, sharing a slice of pie and talking about the future like it was something tangible, not just a vague, maybe someday. Jamie stared out the window for a moment before turning back to me. "Do you think we're ready for this? For really being together, not just in moments or visits?" I took a deep breath. "I think we're as ready as we'll ever be. But maybe that's enough." He nodded, eyes searching mine. "Yeah, enough." The next few weeks passed in this blur of planning and dreaming. We talked about moving into a place together, about blending our lives in ways that felt both exciting and terrifying. Every conversation felt like building a foundation. sometimes shaky, sometimes solid, but always real. One afternoon, while Jamie was at work, I sat in the apartment we'd just signed the lease for, staring at the empty walls. It hit me how much this place represented. A fresh start. A new chapter. I imagined us painting those walls, filling the rooms with laughter and late-night talks, with the messy kind of love that doesn't always make sense but feels like home. When Jamie got home, we spent the evening assembling furniture from that ridiculous Swedish store neither of us could pronounce. We laughed more than we worked, arguing over who was better at following instructions, which was basically a tie since neither of us was great at it. At some point, I looked over at him and realized how easy it felt to be around him. Like all the anxiety and fear I'd carried for months just melted away when he was near. One night, a few weeks before we were supposed to move in officially, Jamie and I were lying in bed, the city lights casting patterns on the ceiling. He turned to me and said, "You know, I was scared when I moved here, scared this would all fall apart." I brushed a strand of hair from his face. "And?" He smiled softly. "But I'm not scared anymore. I'm ready for whatever comes next. With you." I felt my heart swell, this warmth spreading through me I hadn't known was possible. Me too. Life wasn't suddenly perfect. There were still challenges. A job that demanded too much. Nights when stress got the better of us. Moments of doubt that crept in uninvited. But through it all, we kept choosing each other. The day we moved in together, lugging boxes and takeout containers up the stairs, felt like a victory. It wasn't glamorous. It was sweaty, chaotic, and full of misplaced screws. But it was ours. Our space, our story unfolding. That night, as we collapsed onto the floor, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, Jamie looked at me and said, "I never thought I'd find someone who gets all the messy parts of me." I grinned. "Well, you found me." He laughed, pulling me close. "Good, because I'm not going anywhere." And neither was I. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was that night on the bench when I found him crying. It wasn't just a chance encounter. It was the start of something that challenged me, scared me, and ultimately changed me. Sometimes, the people you're meant to find are waiting there in the dark, needing someone to sit beside them. And maybe, just maybe, that someone is you. A few months after we moved in together, life settled into a rhythm that felt right. Not perfect, never perfect, but something steady, something real. We had our routines. Coffee in the mornings, lazy Sunday mornings, tangled up in bed, arguing over which takeout place to order from. But there was this quiet happiness underneath it all. One evening, after a long day of work and errands, we found ourselves back at that park bench, the same one where I first saw Jamie crying on that cold night. The street lamp was still flickering, casting a soft glow over the empty path. We sat close, shoulders touching, neither of us needing to fill the silence. Jamie reached out and took my hand, that familiar, nervous smile playing on his lips. "Funny how life works," he said. "How one night can change everything." I smiled back. "Yeah, I never thought a random walk would lead to this." He squeezed my hand gently. "I'm glad it did." We sat there for a while, just being. And in that quiet, I realized that the messy, uncertain journey we'd been through had brought us here, to this moment of peace and understanding. It wasn't dramatic or flashy. It was simply two people who had chosen each other, flaws and all. As we got up to leave, Jamie pulled me into a hug. "Thank you," he whispered, "for sitting beside me that night, for not walking away." I held him tight, feeling the weight of those words. "Thank you for letting me." Walking home hand in hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the kind that promises everything will be easy, but the kind that says no matter what comes next, we'll face it together. And honestly, that felt like enough.